Have y'all heard about the Candyman? No, not that Candyman. The Candyman we're talking about abducted, essayed, tortured, and murdered at least 28 young men and teenage boys in the 1970s. This American serial killer was also called the Houston Mass Murderer and the Pied Piper. This Candyman was Dean Corll. His mother owned Corll Candy Company, where he lured boys and young men with free candy.
Dean Corll was born on December 24, 1939 in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Corll had one younger brother, Stanley. His parents, Mary and Arnold, didn't get along, and his father was strict and his mother was overly protective of both boys. Corll's parents divorced when Stanley was 4 years old. After the divorce, Arnold was drafted by the Air Force and Mary relocated to Memphis to allow the boys to still have contact with their dad.
Corll was described as a shy, serious child that didn't socialize much with other children. He was also really sensitive to rejection and criticism of any kind. In 1950, Corll's parents tried to fix their relationship and remarried. The family moved to Pasadena, Texas. Unfortunately, Mary and Arnold just couldn't make it work, and after 3 years, they divorced again. Mary had custody of the boys, and Arnold maintained regular contact with them.
Mary would go on to marry again. Jake West was a traveling clock salesman. The Corll family moved once again to another place in Texas. Mary had a little girl with Jake in 1955 and named her Joyce Janine. Mary and Jake started a small candy company out of their garage. Corll and his brother were in charge of running the candy-making machines and packing the candy. Corll had to work day and night while still going to school. Jake went to Houston a lot, and this is where the candy sold the best. While Corll attended high school, he was a good student and well-behaved, but was thought of as a loner.
Once Corll graduated school in the summer of 1958, the family moved to the outskirts of Houston. Jake started a new candy shop called Pecan Prince. At the request of his mother, Corll moved to Indiana to live with his grandma in 1960. Corll had a steady relationship with a girl, but ended up turning down her marriage proposal in 1962. Shortly after that, he returned to Houston to help with the family business. Corll's mom just didn't have any luck in the love department. She and Jake divorced in 1963, and she started her own candy shop, Corll Candy Company. Corll was named the vice president of the new company, while his younger brother was the secretary-treasurer.
Within a year of starting the new candy business, a teenage boy that was working there complained to Mary about Corll making advances towards him. Mary fired the teenager. Not long after this incident, Corll was drafted by the Army and was assigned to Fort Polk, Louisiana for basic training. He hated being in the military and applied for a hardship discharge on the grounds that his mother needed help with the family business. Corll's military records were unblemished and he was granted an honorable discharge. Corll told some of his close acquaintances during his time in the military he realized that he was attracted to men and had experienced his first same-sex experience. People noticed that Corll's mannerisms towards males had changed, especially towards younger men and teenage boys.
Once Corll was back in Houston, he resumed his role as vice president of Corll Candy Company. Jake, Corll's ex-stepfather, still ran Pecan Prince, and the competition was fierce between the two shops. Corll expanded his working hours to fill the public's increasing demand for his family's products. The Corll Candy Company was relocated in 1965 directly across the street to an elementary school. Corll began giving the school kids free candy, especially teen boys. This is how he earned the nicknames Candyman and Pied Piper. The Corll Candy Company employed several teenage boys. Corll was very flirty with them. He even put a pool table in the back of the shop to encourage employees and the local youth to hang out.
In 1967, one of the boys that Corll gave free candy to became one of his young accomplices. David Owen Brooks was only 12 at the time. Brooks often rode with Corll to South Texas. Later, Brooks commented that Corll was the only adult that didn't make fun of his appearance, and he began to see Corll as a sort of father figure. If Brooks needed money, he would go to Corll, and Corll would give it to him. Brooks' parents were divorced, and he lived with his mother in Beaumont, but his father lived in Houston. So when Brooks visited his father, he always made time to see Corll.
In 1968, the Corll Candy Company closed and Corll's mother and sister moved to Colorado. Mary would talk to Corll often on the phone but never saw him again. After the candy company closed, Corll became an electrician. Life seemed to go on more or less normal for Corll. In 1969, Corll began making advances towards Brooks, even going as far as allowing him to perform acts on him. Brooks dropped out of school at 15 and ended up moving back to Houston. He often stayed at Corll's and saw it as a second home.
The normalcy would end in 1970 when Corll killed his first victim. Jeffrey Conan, an 18-year-old college student. Jeffrey disappeared while hitchhiking with another student from University of Texas. Jeffrey was headed to his parents' house in Houston and was dropped off alone on a street corner in the uptown area of town. It is believed that Corll had offered Jeffrey a ride. Around the time of Jeffrey's murder, Brooks walked in on Corll essaying 2 teen boys that were tied to his bed. Corll told Brooks that if he didn't tell anyone, he would buy him a car. Brooks accepted this offer and was rewarded with a green Corvette.
Corll told Brooks that he did kill the 2 boys and offered him $200 for any boy he would bring to his apartment. Brooks agreed. It seemed like easy money to him. Most of Corll's victims were males between the age of 13 to 20, with the majority of them being in their mid-teens and from the low-income area Houston Heights. Later, Brooks brought another boy to Corll, but instead of causing his demise, Corll made him another accomplice for reasons unknown. His name was Elmer Wayne Henley. Most of the time, Corll didn't even pay the boys what he had promised. So instead of $200, they would get only $5 to $10 for each victim. Regardless, both boys continue helping Corll with his evil plans. Later, Henley claimed he only accepted the deal due to his family's financial hardship.
A lot of the victims were friends with Brooks or Henley, and a couple were former employees of the Corll Candy Company. Victims would be lured with the promise of a ride in the Corvette or a nearby party. Unfortunately for these young men, they would be driven to Corll's apartment instead. Often the victims would be supplied with alcohol and drugs until they passed out. They would then be handcuffed and stripped naked. We don't want to go into the details here, but most of the time, these were unwilling encounters that would last for days.
Corll would have the teen call or write their families to explain their absences. Corll would keep a keepsake from the boys, usually keys. After he was done with the victims, he would tie them up in plastic sheeting and bury them in one of 4 places: a beach in Jefferson County, Lake Sam Rayburn, a beach at Bolivar Peninsula, or at a rented boat shed in southwest Houston.
The victim list is long and heart-wrenching. In total, 28 deaths have been linked to Corll and his henchmen. December 1970, Danny Yates and James Glass, both 14, were lured by Brooks to Corll's apartment. January 1971, 2 teen boys, Donald and Jerry Waldrop, hitched a ride from Corll and were never seen again alive. Around March 1971, 15-year-old Randall Harvey was lured to the apartment. 13-year-old David Hillegeist and 16-year-old Gregory Winkle were killed together on May 29, 1971. August 1971, Brooks took an acquaintance, Reuben Haney, to Corll, where he was strangled and buried in the boat shed. December 1971, Corll abducted and killed 2 more youths. These boys are still unidentified. March 1972, Corll, Brooks, and Henley talked to an 18-year-old Frank Aguirre. Frank was offered beer and weed. He had just gotten off work and the offer was too good to pass up. Unfortunately, Frank would fall victim like all the others before and was buried at High Island Beach. By now, Brooks and Henley knew that Corll was murdering these boys, yet they continued to help. April 1972, they all knew the next victim. 17-year-old Mark Scott was grabbed by all 3 men. Mark fought against his attackers, even attempting to stab them. Then a gun was pointed at his head and he gave up. His body was never recovered. June of the same year, the trio had 2 more youths in their grips, Billy Bouch and Johnny DeLome. Henley solo killed the boys. Summer of 1972, Corll killed 2 more victims, Stephen Sickman and Royal Bunton.
Corll moved around a lot during these crimes, but usually stayed close to Houston Heights until moving to Pasadena in 1973, which was about 20 miles away. But before he moved, he killed another teenager, Joseph Lyle. Corll moved to 2020 Lamar Drive, an address where his father had lived, with no known murders occurring between March and May of 73.
However, by the summer of 73, the killings increased significantly. Brooks and Henley said that Corll's escalation was a bloodlust. Both would know when Corll wanted them to bring him a new boy, just by the way he acted. Corll would become restless, chain-smoking cigarettes, and making reflex movements, almost as if he was going through withdrawals. In June, 15-year-old William Lawrence and 20-year-old Raymond Blackburn were abducted, tortured, and killed.
Brooks married his fiancée who was pregnant at the time, so during July 1973, Henley was the only one helping Corll find, abduct, and kill victims. In July, 15-year-old Homer Garcia, an acquaintance of Henley, was going to stay the night. Homer was shot and left in Corll's tub until he was buried at the lake. Just 5 days later, John Sellers, who was 17, was also abducted and bound, shot to death, and buried. Corll's horrible crimes were finally coming to an end, but 4 more males would fall victim to the Candyman before it was all over. 15-year-old Michael Bulch, who was the brother of a previous victim from May 1972, Billy Bulch, Marty Jones, and Charles Coble. His final victim was a 13-year-old named James Dramala.
Early August 1973, Henley invited Timothy Curley over for a party at Corll's. The two were helping paint and drinking. Just shortly after midnight, Henley and Timothy left the house and said they would be back soon. The two went to Houston Heights and parked close to Henley's home. When the two got out of the car, they heard a noise coming from Rhonda Williams' house, a friend of Henley. Rhonda had been beaten by her father and didn't want to go back inside, so she went with Henley and Timothy back to Corll's house around 3 a.m. Corll was pissed that Henley brought a girl to his house because Timothy was supposed to be the next victim. Corll told Henley that he ruined everything. Henley told Corll he only brought Rhonda over because her dad had beaten her and she didn't want to go home. Corll seemed to calm down and allowed the 3 teenagers to drink and smoke pot. The trio passed out about 2 hours later. When the teens woke up, they were all bound and had duct tape on their mouths. Timothy had been stripped naked. Corll took Henley's tape off of his mouth to let him talk. Corll told Henley that he had really messed up by bringing the girl there, and he said he was going to kill all 3 of them, but only after he had his fun. Corll held a .22 pistol against Henley's stomach, threatening to shoot him. Henley told Corll that he wanted to participate in ending the other 2. Corll agreed to untie him. By this point, both Timothy and Rhonda were awake and struggling to get free. Corll began to essay Timothy. Rhonda's gag was removed and she asked Henley if this was for real. Henley's only response was, yes. Rhonda asked him, "Are you going to do anything about it?"
Henley grabbed Corll's gun and shouted at him, "You've gone too far, Dean. I can't go on any longer. I can't have you kill all my friends." Corll told Henley, "Kill me," and as Henley took a few steps back, Corll advanced on him. Corll was shouting, "You won't do it." Henley shot Corll in the forehead then and there. The bullet didn't penetrate his skull. Henley fired 2 more shots, hitting Corll in the shoulder. Corll then turned and ran down the hallway. As he did, Henley fired 3 more shots into Corll's back. Corll slid down the wall and died. Henley wanted to just leave the house, but the other 2 convinced him to call the police. August 8, 1973, at 8:24 a.m., the police were called.
At first, Henley told the police that he killed Corll in self-defense, and Timothy and Rhonda's stories corroborated this. Henley ended up telling the police everything. For almost 3 years, he and Brooks would bring Corll teenage boys so he could essay and kill them. Henley admitted that he had participated in 6 to 8 murders. He also told the police that Corll would pay him and Brooks up to $200 for each boy. The police didn't believe him at first. Henley then gave the names of some of the victims, so the police started to believe there was something to his claims. There was very damning evidence in Corll's house and van. For one, the bedroom floor was covered with plastic. Then the police found the hunting knife, multiple pairs of handcuffs, adult toys, and a ton of rope. Henry agreed to show the police where the victims were. Brooks went to the Houston Police Department with his father on August 8th and gave a statement. He claimed that he had no knowledge of the murders, but admitted that he knew that Corll had essayed and killed the 2 boys in 1970. Henley gave a full written statement about both of his and Brooks' involvement. Henley stated that he personally ended 9 lives and assisted Corll with the others. He said there were only 3 murders that Brooks wasn't involved in. Brooks gave a confession on August 9th and admitted to being there when the killings happened and helped with a lot of the burials. He continued to deny that he participated in killing anyone. Brooks said that Henley was sadistic like Corll.
Mama.
Who's this?
It's Wayne.
Yes, this is Mama, baby.
Mama?
Huh?
Dean.
Wayne?
Ma'am?
What are you doing?
Yeah, yes.
Oh, God.
In 1973, Brooks led the police to where Jeffrey's body was buried. Forensic scientists concluded that Jeffrey was manually strangled, bound, and essayed. Over the next few days, both Henley and Brooks accompanied the police to search for the bodies. The total number of victims were 28. At the time, this was the worst killing spree in the U.S. The families of the missing boys were very critical of the Houston Police Department because of the police had quickly written their children off as runaways. Others said the police should have investigated the matter better and connected the dots that the boys were almost all missing from Houston Heights. Everett Waldrop, the father of Donald and Jerry, had told the police back in 1971 that it looked like Corll was burying bodies by his boat shed. The police did go out there and do a quick search, but just dismissed it without any further investigation. Every time Everett went to the police, the chief would say to him, "Why are you down here? You know your boys are runaways."
This entire story would almost appear to be fiction, scripted with the full intention of shocking readers over and over again. It's that hard to believe. So many lives involved, so many killed over such a long period of time, and all of it going undetected. But it's not fiction. It's very real. A deadly conspiracy now listed as one of the most horrifying crimes in this century. An innocent-looking Pasadena home, but some of the people who went in were carried out in plastic bags. They had been murdered. Death in most cases came after the victims had been subjected to various acts and torture. The victims were all boys in the early to mid-teens who allegedly had been lured into a death trap by this young man, 17-year-old Elmer Wayne Henley. It was Henley who unveiled this secret of mass killings and led police to the graves of the dead. Henley called the police to the home of Dean Corll. He said he killed that Pasadena resident. Henley said the 34-year-old Corll had talked about killing several young men and burying them in this boat storage in South Houston. Henley said he and two other young people were intended victims Wednesday morning. At that time, they had passed out at Corll's house after an all-night party.
I woke up and he was clamping handcuffs on me. I was laying on my stomach. The other two were on their stomach and they were handcuffed and their feet were tied. I'd torture them if he'd let me go.
What, he wants you to kill them then?
To begin with, he wanted to kill me. He was mad because I brought the chick over there. The chick wanted to run away from home and I was going to travel with Dean. I thought it was safe. I didn't know no better.
Henley said Corll did turn him loose, and then he described what happened next to the others, another young man and a teenage girl.
He let me up and took them into a bedroom and strapped them to the board. Strapped Tim on his stomach, spread eagle on the board, and strapped Rhonda beside the board beside Tim on her back. First he wanted Tim to take Rhonda, but Tim couldn't or he wouldn't or something. And so he wanted me to take her, and he was going to mess with Tim.
And Henley says he shot Corll repeatedly. Henley's initial story makes it sound as if he were in effect a hero, but police suspicions were confirmed the next day. Henley said he had been involved in the murder and burial of some victims found in the dirt floor of this storage shed. For most of Wednesday night, lawmen continued to unearth bodies. All supposedly young boys, early to mid-teens, all had their hands tied, the bodies wrapped in plastic. Lime had been poured over the victims to help decompose the bodies. It did a more than adequate job. Bits and pieces of skeletons were removed time and time again. In some cases, flesh clung to bones like jelly. The stench inside that shed was almost overpowering. Those with weak stomachs stayed out. Just before closing down the digging operations for that night, a lieutenant in the Houston Homicide Division talked about the victims, and he talked about the killers. How would you classify this series of crimes?
Just like I said a while ago, hell of a sadistic type of a clown that'd pull something like this.
And you think most of these victims are young boys?
I'm pretty reasonably sure they are. The reports that we have, missing persons, are all a bunch of kids, 13, 14, 15 years old.
The death site and the grave site itself appears tragic enough, but do you think many of them went under any torture?
Well, when you're fooling with a nut like this, that's a pervert, you can expect mostly anything.
So the digging operation ceased for that night. Now the public knew 8 bodies had been found in this shed, but this was just beginning, and that became evident the following day. Thursday, lawmen returned to the grave site. Shovels again dug into the soil in the 12 by 30 shed. The death count started rising. There was another body, and still another, and another. When the digging was finally completed in this shed, 17 bodies had been recovered. According to the owners of the boat storage, Dean Corll had always been prompt in paying his rent on this boat stall, which he had for nearly 3 years. Recently, he had been politely asking the owners if they didn't have another stall for rent. He said his was getting too crowded. The trail of graves stretched into the piney woods of East Texas near Sam Rayburn Lake, not too far from Lufkin. Henley told Lawman that he helped Corll bury more victims in this area. At this time, 18-year-old David Brooks of Houston was also in custody as a suspect. Henley pointed to one spot and said, "There are 2 bodies here, but only one was uncovered." So Henley said, "That means there are 2 at the other site." Again, the shovels dug in, and Henley decided to start talking again also.
Now, these just some boys that he picked up, or I helped him get, rather. And he raped them, ended up killing them, brought them down here and buried them.
What part did you play in any of the killing, or did you?
No comment.
Wayne, this has been going on for some time, hasn't it?
Everybody dropping that kind of credit card bill? No?
A year ago last winter.
That's when you got into it.
Yes.
Now, you know, or you think you know, that maybe he was involved in this more than a year ago, right?
I know.
In what way do you know?
And I was told
By him?
by him, by David Brooks.
Now, David Brooks is another person who has been named. Now, what role did he play in all of this?
Same as mine.
The digging at the second spot produced only one more body before Lawman decided to call a halt for the night. They were to return the next morning, and they would uncover 2 more victims. That meant one Henley didn't know about. In other words, how many others could have been killed before Henley or Brooks became a part of all of this? It was possible, Henley said, that Corll had other young men working for him in the past, using them to procure boys for his sexual fantasies, using them to pimp for him, and then later killing them just as he started to murder Henley. Yesterday, the trail of graves took Lawman and Newsman to the southeast of Houston. Henley and Brooks said there were more bodies buried along the Gulf of Mexico. By now, the scene was becoming all too familiar. Shovels digging into dirt and yielding bodies. Heavy equipment was called in to assist in the recovery operations. Since there were few landmarks along the beach, Henley was having some trouble recalling the graves, but his directions did uncover more human remains. The white of lime mixed with the red of blood, bones, bits of flesh, again the undescribable smell of a decayed human body. The operations moved down the beach. At one point it stopped beside this camper. A Beaumont family out to spend a quiet day along the Gulf learned that they were within 10 feet of another victim. As the digging started and revealed the remains of still another body, the family packed up their camper. Yes, they had heard about the mass killings, but to learn that they were at the same spot where a teenage boy had been buried under 2 feet of sand, the Beaumont couple and their son headed for home. Before Henley and Brooks were returned to jail, Henley wanted to talk to reporters. He had told me earlier that the stories he read in the newspapers contained lies. Henley said he wanted to clear up and correct things, like his full name, and what happened to that girl at Corll's house Tuesday night and Wednesday morning, and a couple of other things most important to him.
And when that boy turned himself in, I had not yet made a statement. I didn't make a statement till after he made his. So I didn't implicate him. He hung himself. That's all I want to say. I never said there were 30 people. I said 24. The name's Junior, not Elmer Wayne Henley. Well, get your pictures.
Henley and Brooks had separate trials. Henley was charged with 6 murders after all of the evidence. The jury only deliberated for 92 minutes before finding him guilty of all 6 counts. He received 99 years for each murder, for a total of 594 years behind bars. Brooks would only be charged with 1 murder and sentenced to life in prison. Brooks showed no emotion when the sentence was handed down. His wife, who was at his trial, was crying. Brooks continued to appeal this decision until it was dismissed in May of '79. Brooks stayed in prison until he died of COVID on May 28, 2020. Henley is still in prison. All of his parole applications have been denied. The next time he can apply for parole is October 2025. What do you think about today's case? Have you heard of it before? Let us know in the comments below.